My name is Pablo McConnie-Saad. I'm from Puerto Rico, but I grew up in Philadelphia.
So tell us about your story, from the beginning. How did you end up in Philadelphia? Tell us a little bit about your family.
Yeah, it's a unique story, I think. My parents are both from a small town called Ponce, which is in the south of Puerto Rico. It's the historical capital of the island, and so in many ways similar to Philadelphia. And they met in college at the Catholic University of Puerto Rico, which is in Ponce. And they both were drawn to each other for their spiritualism. And at that time, my father really was involved in the East Asian New Wave movement and really into yoga and Eastern religion. And when they met, they had that in common, although my mother was more of the spiritualism of Puerto Rico, which is similar to Santeria, but unique in its own way, and saw a lot of similarities with the spiritualism of Eastern religions, and they were both vegetarian and vegan. And when they graduated from the Catholic University, my mom started a master's program in San Juan at the University of Puerto Rico, and so then they both moved to San Juan, and as they were going through, and my father then started his own master's degree there, and as they were going through that, they had friends who were leaving the island and moving to different parts of the States, and one of their dearest friends had moved to Philadelphia and said that they should check out this city, that there's a growing movement of Eastern religion here. There's a really great yogi here, and they thought that it would also be a good city to raise their children.
Wow,
and so
that sounds so cool.
Yeah.
I want to get to meet them at some point. And I spent a lot of time in South Philly. When I moved to Philadelphia, I also lived in South Philly. How was growing up in that part of town?
So it's totally different from what it is today when I was growing up. South Philly, so I grew up, when my parents moved in 1983, I wasn't born yet, they moved to 3rd and Catherine, and it was a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a corner building, and they started to work and found it was really difficult to be able to buy a home. And so they had to move a lot because they were constantly being rejected for mortgages, but not because they couldn't pay for one. It was really because of their identity as Puerto Ricans. And so we moved within Queen Village, which is where they first moved to Bella Vista, and then back to Queen Village, and then back to Bella Vista. So by the time I was in high school, graduating high school, we had moved 7 times, I believe, within those 2 neighborhoods in South Philadelphia. And in that time, the neighborhood transformed from being a very blighted, low-income, dangerous neighborhood. There were these public housing projects that were totally blighted, not taken care of, and a lot of despair and resentment in those communities. And in the late 90s, they were demolished, and then that's when you started to see both displacement of some of the families that had been there for a long time when I was growing up, mm-hmm. to a revitalization, because there were also a lot of abandoned buildings, abandoned warehouses. Fabric Row is near there, so there were a lot of warehouses for the textiles, and those slowly were transformed into living units, and that sort of started to bring up the neighborhoods.
No, as first or even second generation kids, like Latinos in particular, like we see a lot of stuff, and we get to experience a lot of these things that our parents go through. I remember as a child, like having to be the translator, and here I am, translating like medical records and immigration stuff and education stuff that we like. I don't even know what especially when you're a child.
Yeah.
What were some of those like lessons that that you learned seeing your parents trying to find stability in a system that it's not really built for them?
I learned that discrimination has no bounds, no boundaries. Because, as I said, my parents were rejected because of their identity from being able to own a home, not because they couldn't afford it. And as I said, they were getting master's degrees, so they are educated individuals, and they're Puerto Rican. So unlike other Latinos and Hispanics who have to go through an immigration process, they didn't have to do that because they were already U.S. citizens. And that's where it gets very interesting, and we're seeing that play out today, where there's a lack of education, and that lack of education on who is of belonging, really, translates into this discrimination and this prejudice. I mean, we saw it play out with the Super Bowl halftime show and Bad Bunny, and so many people telling him to go back home as if he's a foreigner who doesn't belong here and doesn't represent American values. And that's just a false narrative, because we all represent American values. And that's what makes this place so great, is that despite the travails and hardships that brought our families here, it's still a place where you can find belonging. And so I think that's important.
And fast forward to today, now you're raising your child.
Yeah.
I'm assuming in that same area. How's that different? Like just thinking of like you growing up in South Philly to now raising your own child.
It's, I don't have a very full answer yet, because my child is only, at this time of filming, only 4 days old. So I don't know what that will be like, but I do know that it's been important for me growing up to speak my parents' language. And I remember my parents being criticized heavily by people in the city, some of their friends telling them that if they speak to us in Spanish, that we won't learn English well, and we'll become confused, and this will be a problem, and they need to speak to us in English because that's the only way to assimilate and become part of the culture of Philadelphia. And my parents rejected that completely, and I'm so grateful because it opened so many doors to me. And so as my wife and I look to our child and raising our child, my wife is also from Ponce, from Puerto Rico. She grew up there while I grew up here. Our parents grew up together, actually. That's how we met. Not arranged, though. Just happenstance. And but we will want to have our daughter learn about our culture and speak our language and feel like she can belong in both worlds.
Yeah.
Because I think that's important. And it doesn't have to, even though she'll likely grow up here, I think it's important for her to still know that she can belong somewhere else. And something that I believe that will be important for her to know is my parents' language.
I've heard, kind of like the opposite sentiment from people who, especially with everything that's happening, today, and in terms of, the threats and discriminations against Latinos, just because of the way, we look and sound and, our culture. What do you say to those people who don't embrace their, identities and who are not, standing up to what's happening?
I think that you should be proud of who you are. Yesterday, Reverend Jesse Jackson passed away, and one of the statements that he used to say and repeat over and over again was, "I am somebody." And that means to me that you have to believe in yourself, and you have to be okay with who you are. And that should translate beyond just whether you're Latino, Hispanic, to any other identity that you associate with. You are who you are, and you should wear that proudly. And one of the things that I think is so great about places like the United States is that even though we're experiencing some of this discrimination, and it's very challenging, it is also a place of welcoming. And we also have the opportunity to have these conversations. You and I sitting here, this doesn't exist in other places. This doesn't exist in some of our home countries. And I think that's important to take note of. You can't have a conversation about identity in other places.
Absolutely. So now just touching on education, which, sounds like from your own background, your family, education has always been sort of an important, North Star, right? How has that sort of translated to, your own journey and the choices that you've made?
I think that at an early age, my parents instilled in us the value of education because they understood that an educated community can't be coerced. An educated community can see what is right and what is wrong and can understand what is happening around them and make the changes that they need. And so for my parents, it was very important that their children have good education. And it was also important that we learn to read and write also in Spanish. And so we did. And that was really great because it expanded my horizons into a whole nother world. But because the school system in Philadelphia was so underfunded when I was growing up, they quickly realized that they couldn't send us just to public school because here the reality was that there existed a school-to-prison pipeline. They didn't call it that at that time, but my parents were seeing it. Mm-hmm. And so they really worked hard to make sure that we were able to receive need-based scholarships to go to good private schools in the city. And when we were younger, and then as a adolescent, I was able to get a community scholarship to go to a good Quaker school in the city. And from there, college was really important. And then I went to graduate school and pursued graduate degrees related to policy.
And that's my next question. So tell us about, first of all, that experience of, deciding to go into public policy. Why?
I was really interested in understanding the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. And I felt like I wasn't going to learn about it just hearing from people or reading the news. I needed to know the history, and I needed to know a history that went back. And history really is public policy from a particular moment in time. And so it was important to study, generations ago, how Puerto Rico became a Spanish colony, who was living in Puerto Rico before the Spaniards arrived, and then how is the Puerto Rican identity today informed by the slave trade, informed by the indigenous communities that were there? Why is our flag similar to Cuba's flag? How did the colors get decided upon? How are the names in the towns decided upon? And then how does that translate to our community in Philadelphia, which is the largest Puerto Rican population after New York in this country, outside of the island, of course. And so that's what motivated me. It was really just wanting to know more about myself and who I am that drove me to do that. And then as I was going down that road, down that rabbit hole, I started to learn about the world and how everything is connected. And then the frustrations of, well, if this is how it happened, then why haven't we gone here? Why haven't we fixed this yet? In a place like Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, why hasn't there been a Latino representing us ever when we have one of the largest Puerto Rican populations? And that doesn't include all of the other Hispanic Latino populations that live here.
So tell us about your experience in government and how once you were immersed in that world as a Latino, not a lot of representation, but how was that experience?
It was both eye-opening, but incredibly rich at the same time, because I learned that while other people may be well-intentioned, not having a Latino in the room when certain decisions are being made means that certain decisions don't consider an entire population. Not because they don't care about them, it's just not something that they're aware of. And the rich part is that there's so many people working so hard to try to improve the social well-being of everyone in this country and really beyond that was rewarding, because people think of government as this black box of corruption where decisions are made by insiders, and really no one cares about the people and no one cares about outcomes and improving lives. It's really all self-centered. And there is some truth to that, but my experience was that there is also an enormous amount of people working in government. And I'm speaking more about the people who are there as professionals, who are really interested in improving society through whatever agency they work in.
You worked on national scale initiatives that most people only hear about in headlines, right? What's something about that work that the public rarely sees, or or like a myth that oftentimes we assume when we hear about this or that initiative coming from the government?
I think there is a lot of work that's being done in the background that goes unnoticed. And so people forget that once a law gets passed, then you need an entire new team to put it into action. And that's part of what I was doing. I was putting into action this bill called the Inflation Reduction Act. And it was a bill designed to move this country away from fossil fuels and move us towards renewable energy sources, which are cheaper, more affordable, and better for the environment. And that has a rippling effect that improves our health. It improves the air we breathe, the environment, reduces pollution, and continues to create jobs, which is something that is certainly front of mind when people are concerned about the economy. We were creating jobs. The challenge there was going from this tiny city, this building in Washington, D.C., where I was working, and bringing this to the entire globe, because it had global implications. And with my team, we were working extensively on how to get trusted messengers to communicate that this existed and they could benefit in their communities from some of these provisions, and then explaining it to them. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is that part of my work also involved around the IRS. And people only think of the IRS as the agency that takes your tax dollars out of your paycheck. And people don't like that. And I understand. I also don't like it. But the black hole there is, what happens to that money? What do we do with that money? And so part of what I was doing with my team was transforming the IRS so that it wouldn't be just the tax collector that takes the money out of your bank account, out of your paycheck every week or month. It was also an agency that could give something back to you. Because they do. I mean, the IRS does fund the government, and it funds the states, and it funds the cities, and it funds the nonprofits, and it funds everything that we use to make society function. We just needed to make it better and do it in a way that people could maybe feel that impact and then point to it and say, you know what? Now I know where my money is going. unfortunately, we had a small window to do it, and I don't know that we were able to, make a big enough impact for people to feel it before this new administration came in and stopped it.
What do you say to, people who feel so disconnected from, their local politicians or, candidates, from their own elected officials? I think, we're in a moment where, regardless of which side you're on, people just don't, feel the need to, even though, we're seeing things in front of us, but, they feel disconnected and they don't want to be engaged. What do you say to them?
I say, firstly, I don't blame you, because our politicians haven't been present. Our representatives haven't been representing us. I've never seen our representatives in my neighborhood. When I was growing up, they weren't present there. And so I don't blame them. We've been voting for the same type of politician with less and less to show for it. So I don't blame them. When you don't see the changes happening, then you recede. You step back and you say, well, there's nothing I can do. You become resigned. And that needs to change too, because we still have the opportunity to make a difference. And so I would say now is the time to step up. Put pressure on people, put pressure on your politicians, put pressure on your representatives. Let them know that if they don't step up, that they're out.
And, you recently had your daughter. Has your perspective changed at all, or has this been a sort of a reinforcement of this is, one of the reasons why I want to do this?
Yeah, it's a reinforcement for sure. A strong one. I want my daughter to have a place that she can feel comfortable living in, both in terms of the relationships she can cultivate with the people around her so that she feels safe, both as a woman, as a Latina, and as just a Philadelphian, as a human being in society. I want her to feel like she's not going to be attacked for being a woman, because I see that happening. I don't want her to be attacked for being Latina, because that's obviously happening as well. I want her to feel like she can belong here in a way that she deserves, with dignity, and that she's respected for her decisions, and that she's able to make her own decisions. And I also want her to have an environment. I want her to have trees and clean air and clean water to drink, because those are resources that are getting depleted.
And now, as we, sort of reflect, what advice would you have for, a younger self? Let's say, 10, 15 years ago. What would you say to yourself?
I've always been more on the shy side. So I would say to myself, don't be scared. Don't be shy. People want to hear from you. So don't wait.
And in this difficult moment that we're seeing, what gives you hope, and what would you say to people who are, afraid and disconnected again?
I've spoken to so many people who feel that resignation that things aren't going to change. And then as we're discussing what the issues are, I see them get animated. And so I realize that there is still hope. And also I think that part of the hope that feels like it's getting lost is related to the fact that we're being bombarded with negativity. And that's not because we don't need to know about all of the negative things that are happening, but it takes out the space of all of the opportunities and the positive things that can happen. and I want to use this like as an inverse, but historically there was always talk on the right of how there's a silent majority, and that's what's going to propel the right wing into power. And right now I believe that there's actually a silent majority to combat that, and we just need to stop being silent. And so the same advice I would give to a younger version of myself, don't be silent, I would say to everyone else. And that gives me hope, because I think that as I speak to people, I hear that there's still hope, and people do want to make a change and do want to see a difference. Just because they feel it, I think it's because they don't really know how. There are a ton of organizations out there that they can get involved in and start being loud and no longer being silent. And when you're with other people, it's easier. It builds confidence. And so find friends and be loud together.
And now these are like the fun questions, but I want to know your recommendations, your places to go in Philly. Where can people, like, what do you do for fun? Like, what in the city? Restaurants, favorite restaurant if you have one.
So I would say I don't really go out very much anymore, but I love pizza. So my favorite pizza place is Square Pie. It's right there on the corner of Catherine and Passyunk. And I like to run outdoors. It's one of my favorite ways of exploring different neighborhoods and seeing how the city is transforming. I go on these long runs where I'll run through South Philadelphia, I'll run through Center City, I'll go to the new Schuylkill trails and see how that area is developing and changing, go down along the Delaware River and see how that's all transforming. For me, that's my favorite part, because it's a way to, the other thing is, like, when you run long distance, if you can, get over that hump, which a lot of people, I don't blame you. It's a great way to kind of let your mind just relax, really, because you don't have to think about anything, and you don't really have to think about running either. There's a fun book by a Japanese author, Haruki Murakami, called What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. And it really is an exploration into how he explores ideas while he's running. And so you get the benefits of the exercise, but also it's a freeing experience, really, for the mind.
Wonderful. Is there anything else that you want to add?
Don't stay silent. Let's get out there.
Perfect. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.